Canary Islands, an archipelago located off the northwest coast of Africa, have a rich and complex history shaped by the arrival of Spanish settlers and their interactions with the indigenous African populations, primarily the Guanche people. This historical narrative unfolds over centuries, encompassing conquest, cultural exchange, resistance, and eventual assimilation. Indigenous population, the Guanches. Before the arrival of Spanish settlers, the Canary Islands were inhabited by the Guanches, a Berber-descended people with roots tracing back to North Africa, particularly the Atlas Mountains region. The Guanches are believed to have arrived around 1000 BCE and developed a unique culture adapted to the island's isolated environment. Their society was organized into small kingdoms or tribes, each ruled by a mense, king. They practiced pastoralism, rudimentary agriculture, and lived in caves or stone dwellings. Despite the isolation, the Guanches exhibited a rich spiritual life, with beliefs centered around natural elements and deities. They mummified their dead, similar to certain North African cultures, and had a developed oral tradition for transmitting history and knowledge. Early European interest in exploration. European interest in the Canary Islands can be traced back to the classical period, but it intensified in the late Middle Ages due to the island's strategic location for Atlantic trade and exploration. Genoese, Portuguese, and Spanish explorers frequented the islands from the 14th century onward. In the early 1400s, the Kingdom of Castile, led by Henry III, initiated efforts to conquer the archipelago. The Canary Islands were seen as a key stepping stone for further exploration and a resource base for the expanding Iberian kingdoms. Spanish Conquest, 1402–1496. The systematic Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands began in 1402 under the leadership of Jean de Béthencourt and Gadeffer de la Salle, French nobles commissioned by the Castilian crown. The process was gradual, with significant resistance from the indigenous populations. Key events of the conquest: Lanzarote and Fuerteventura, 1402–1405. These islands fell relatively quickly due to limited Guanche resistance and alliances formed with certain local leaders. Gran Canaria, 1478–1483. The conquest of Gran Canaria was more brutal and protracted. The indigenous population fiercely resisted, led by the heroic figure Doramus. Ultimately, superior Spanish weaponry and tactics led to their defeat. Tenerife, 1494–1496. The final and most challenging conquest occurred on Tenerife. The Guanche leader Bencomo initially repelled the Spaniards in the Battle of Acentejo, but Spanish forces eventually subdued the island after a prolonged campaign marked by both military engagements and the spread of European diseases. By 1496, the entire archipelago was under Castilian control. The conquest was marked by significant violence, but also alliances with some indigenous factions, cultural interactions, and assimilation. Following the conquest, the Spanish settlers imposed their language, culture, and Catholic religion on the islands. However, the cultural exchange was complex and not entirely one-sided. Religious transformation. The Spanish authorities aggressively promoted Catholicism, often converting the Guanches by force. However, syncretic practices emerged where indigenous beliefs blended with Christian rituals. Language. Spanish became the dominant language, but Guanche linguistic elements survived, especially in place names and some vocabulary integrated into Canarian Spanish. Intermarriage and racial mixing. There was significant intermarriage between Spanish settlers and the Guanche population. This blending gave rise to the modern Canarian people, whose genetic makeup reflects both European and North African ancestry. Economic changes. The Spanish introduced European agricultural practices, including crops like sugarcane and vines, which transformed the economy. The islands became key in the Atlantic triangular trade, serving as a hub for crops and enslaved laborers. Impact on the Guanche population. The indigenous population faced catastrophic declines due to a combination of factors. Violence. The initial conquests resulted in mass killings and displacement. Disease. European diseases like smallpox devastated the Guanche population, who lacked immunity. Enslavement. Many Guanches were enslaved and taken to mainland Europe. By the 16th century, the Guanche culture had been largely absorbed into the colonial framework, with only fragments of their language and traditions surviving. Legacy and modern identity. Today, the legacy of the Guanches and Spanish settlers remains deeply embedded in Canarian identity. Archaeological sites, mummies, and petroglyphs continue to be discovered, sparking renewed interest in indigenous history. The modern Canarian population acknowledges both its Spanish and Guanche heritage, with cultural festivals and research projects aimed at preserving this dual identity. The influx of Spanish settlers reshaped the Canary Islands profoundly, turning them into a culturally rich but historically scarred region where indigenous voices continue to echo through history.